The United States is scrambling to deal with unaccompanied migrant children crossing the southern border. CBS News has learned federal officials are touring an Army base in Fort Benning, Georgia today as a possible location for some of the children. This comes as the Trump administration tells CBS News it is canceling most education, legal aid, and recreational activity, including soccer, for the children held in custody. CBS News investigative reporter Graham Cates has been tracking this story for us. He's been working on this beat for quite some time. Graham, what are you hearing? What's the latest on this?
Right now, as we speak, government officials are at Fort Benning, and what they're looking for is just large vacant space where they can just put more beds to provide basic services for unaccompanied migrant children who come across the border. And that's a big difference. As you noted, it's not just keeping kids alive. Typically, they're supposed to be learning English or even in some cases learning Spanish and being provided with legal opportunities and a lot of other services that are required by law for the agency to provide them with.
Why Fort Benning or any Army base for that matter?
For a long time this year, across the South, HHS has been looking for new locations for shelters. When we first started reporting on this kind of in depth about a year ago, there were less than 100 shelters. Now they're up over 160. And they're saying as this influx that they're tracking continues, they just want to make sure that they have extra space in a large-scale capacity, similar to the one that they have in Homestead, Florida.
So the Office of Refugee Resettlement, as you say, is required by law to house children. They took in 40,900 children during the first 7 months of the current fiscal year. That's an increase of 57% from last year. Are they able to handle, do they have the capacity to handle the huge influx that we're seeing?
What they're saying is basically no. They're saying we need an extra $2.9 billion. Otherwise, we're required by law to have the beds, but that's all we're going to provide is kind of a safe shelter and basic medical services, but nothing else.
All right, so let's look at what the president and his supporters in the Senate and in Congress have been saying, which is that this is why you need funding for a wall. There's been a huge influx in immigration. Migration has continued to happen across the southern border, and the United States just doesn't have the capacity, as evidenced by what you're uncovering. What does that argument hold weight? Because here's the question. The president has said being tougher on the border and building this wall is what is going to prevent this. But what we've seen under the Trump administration is a huge increase in illegal immigration.
Well, that's the thing. So we've had waves of unaccompanied migrant children before, and it's a kind of a different class altogether than the rest of the immigration community, for lack of a better word. And there's no telling that this wave is going to last another year, another 2 years, even a few more months. They're projecting it's going to last through the year. They're worried about that because it's been so intense, an extra 57%, as you said. But when it comes to migrant children and the requirement that beds and other services be provided for them, it's almost an entirely different topic from the general wave of immigration. And I don't know if anyone's ever studied whether or not a wall will protect children who are desperate enough to come by themselves on that journey.
Right, so you're making that distinction, which is that the discussion frequently that the president or the argument that the president delivers on television or at his rallies is around illegal immigration, which both Democrats and Republicans believe needs to be fixed. What you're reporting on are unaccompanied migrant children who make the perilous journeys from whatever country they're coming from and end up in the United States. And by law, this is what I think is we need to drive home. There are laws in place to protect these children. There are laws in place that require the United States government to house them, to feed them, and to provide some of those recreational services, which some people might say, why do they need soccer? Why do we need to teach them English? Because it's the law.
Yeah, it's a law. And it's funny because there's the conflicting laws. They have to provide those services, but they also have to protect their agency. There's another law that says once your agency is about to spend more than it has, you have to cut back on services. And so now they have no choice, according to them, but to cut back on services that they're also required by law to provide. It's a really sticky situation.
So now the OR is looking at various Army bases. Is that a solution long term?
I don't even think that they would tell you it's a solution long term, but on the other hand, right now the largest facility in the country is very controversial. It's a place called Homestead. It's a facility in Homestead, Florida. There's thousands of kids there, and it's supposed to be temporary as well, but at this point it's been open for more than a year, and it keeps expanding. So yes, the plan is for it to be temporary, but the question is, are any of their temporary facilities at this point really temporary?
Have we heard it all from members of Congress?
Yeah, so there's really two sides to this, as always, Democrats and Republicans. And on the Democratic side, they're saying, yeah, we're willing to keep funding ORR. Everyone's in agreement about that. But they're looking for more protections for the children and more protections for the families of the children to whom they'll ultimately be placed. They're saying we want to know that ORR isn't going to take the information when they're trying to figure out where the children should live and send it to ICE. And they're also saying we want to make sure that the facilities that they're staying in have better health care and are trying to move them out to their families as fast as possible.
Finally, Graham, let me just ask you this. We're talking about children. We're talking about minors. These are young children for the most part. What happens to them? I mean, regardless of where they're able to be housed, whether they're able to receive the services that they're required to receive by law, what happens to them generally?
Eventually, almost every kid gets placed with a sponsor. That's like a relative, but they're just placed with the sponsor while their typical immigration cases are running through the system. So a lot gets sent home. Some end up in foster care. Some end up living with relatives who are here in the U.S. And then there's a very small amount that stay at these shelters well past when they're supposed to. We've heard of kids who are in the shelters for 6 months, even longer.
Wow. Graham Cates, important reporting that you're doing for CBS News. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.